Hi, this is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at DeAtramentis Dark Reseda. I'll be doing a writing sample with Dark Reseda on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper in a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll compare writing samples that I did on other types of paper. I'll compare DeAtramentis Dark Reseda to other similar inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Dark Reseda felt pretty watery in my glass dip nib, and you can see it came off the nib pretty quickly here at first, but then wrote pretty uniformly after that. The swatch that I made with tweezers had trouble holding on to Tomoe River and some of the other papers that I tested. There wasn't really a drip at the end of the swatch, maybe just a little bit of one, but even in the heavier swatch here at the beginning, I'm not seeing any sheen on this ink. However, at a distance, the shading seems pretty subtle. I'm going to begin with my Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. I was concerned when this ink felt so watery in my glass dip nib. I thought it might not provide enough cushion for my fine nibs, but Dark Reseda in this extra fine Pilot nib is nice and smooth and very crisp and legible. Next, I'll be writing with my Pilot Prera. It has a fine stainless steel nib. The fine nib feels a little dry. Part of the problem might be that the ink feels a little watery, and so I might be tempted to press a little harder on the nib. I'm not sure. I might be writing with a heavier hand than I was with the extra fine. This nib felt a little bit drier, not quite as pleasant as the extra fine. I'll just say that this one was okay. Next, I'll be writing with my Leonardo Momento Zero in the jade finish. It has a stainless steel extra fine nib. This extra fine nib is a bit broader than even the Pilot fine nib, and it's laying down a bit more ink, and it doesn't feel as dry. It feels like you can feel the ink kind of lubricating the nib. This was very smooth and very pleasant. Next, I've got my Pilot Explorer. It has a medium stainless steel nib. Normally, I prefer Pilot fine nibs over the mediums, but with some inks, including this one, I really like the medium. I like the way it feels. It's nice and smooth, just the right amount of ink being put down on the page. Let me check the reverse writing. Yeah, this is a nice versatile nib. I did do a little smoothing earlier on the reverse writing. It was just a little scratchy to the left, and so I just did a little smoothing on micro mesh. Now I've got a very versatile nib, puts down a very nice medium line, and then also a very nice extra fine line. This is very nice and smooth. Next, I'll be writing with a Conklin Minigraph. It has a stainless steel stub nib. This little stub nib is nice and smooth, and it really brings out the shading in this ink. This ink doesn't have that splotchy type of shading. It's pretty smooth in its transition between the darker and lighter shades, and this nib is very smooth and very pleasant. Next, I've got a Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. Very wet, but it feels very dry. Like you can't feel the ink. It feels like you're just writing with a dry nib. But this nib, the tipping on this nib is so broad that it's still very smooth and it's very pleasant. But you can hear the nib on the paper. It's kind of, I like the sound of the scritchy scratchy nib on the paper. I think it's a pleasant writing experience. Let me see the reverse writing of this nib. Again, this is another very versatile nib, uh, but I will have to say later on one of the other papers, the reverse writing was unpleasant. So it will vary from ink to ink and paper to paper how pleasant the reverse writing is. And finally, I'll be writing with a Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stainless steel stub nib. Very wet, but again, the ink is so watery that you can't really feel the ink on the page. So this nib is very broad and very smooth, so it's still a smooth writing experience. And the shading just looks really nice as well. Okay, while that's drying, I'll take a look at some writing samples on other papers. The swatch that I did on Rhodia held onto the paper really nicely and made a nice crisp swatch. You can see it's really dark down here at the end. This watery ink came out of the tweezers really quickly, but then was very uniform after that. Every nib felt a little bit dry on this paper, but some felt nicer than others. Like the stub nib, it still felt nice and velvety and was pleasant. The Kaweco, I mentioned this earlier, the reverse writing felt dry, which is unusual for that nib. Several of the nibs felt dry, but the Conklin Minigraph, the Pilot Explorer, and the Kakuno were my favorites. As usual, copy paper is not my favorite to write on with fountain pens, and I made a note down here that all of the pens felt dry to a certain degree, except for the Kakuno. Strangely, that extra fine nib felt really nice on this paper. I went back, some of these I had marked that they felt nice, but then as I was comparing them to other writing samples, I was like, no, the Kakuno did feel nice, but these others, They were just okay. If I had to write an entire page, it would be okay. It wouldn't be a pleasant experience, though. Compared to some previous inks, like some of the Roshizuku inks, I was kind of surprised. Not as much came through the paper, though some did. But this is fairly heavy copy paper, so you're normally really thin copy paper, you would have more coming through the page. So I don't usually plan on writing on both sides when I'm writing on copy paper. When I started my writing samples with DeAtramentis Dark Reseda, I started thinking about my olivine or olive type inks, but as I started pulling those out, I noticed there was a lot more yellow in these inks than I'm seeing in Dark Reseda. So then I pulled out some of my greens that have a bit more blue in them. Oh, don't even worry about Cioro. It's much more green than that in real life. I've already been through that in a previous video, but even these two are much more blue than Dark Reseda. Then I started pulling out some of my most favorite green inks, which I feel like have a bit of a gray component to them. Maybe not the Edelstein as much, but these three, Verdant Lantide, Diamine Green Black, and DeAtramentis Jane Austen, are all very similar to Dark Reseda. And I am wondering if Dark Reseda is maybe the same ink. In the swatch and the scribble, they look very similar. But notice the swatch held onto the paper a bit better, and the little scribble that I do with the tweezers. I did get, there's not any sheen, but I did get a drip with some halo, whereas it spread out a bit more uniformly here. However, I did notice I was reading about Dark Reseda on Van Ness's website, and they did say that DeAtramentis makes their inks in small batches, so there can be some variation from bottle to bottle. But I know my bottle of Jane Austen says it's the same thing as dark green, and Dark Reseda is also called Dark Reseda Green, so I don't know. They're close enough that if I had a bottle of one, I wouldn't go out and buy a bottle of the other one. The writing sample that I did on Tomoe River paper was let dry for about an hour. Then I submerged it in water for 10 minutes, and all the green lifted off the paper, and all that was left is this gray component. And in an old water resistance test that I did for several other inks, Jane Austen had a similar gray component that was left behind. I can't find my water resistance test for Verde Atlantide, but I'm pretty sure, I'll have to go back and look on Instagram, I'm pretty sure it has a gray component that is left behind. I'm starting to get enough inks that I've tested that I'm having trouble keeping up with the characteristics of each. So I like on my Instagram page to go back and rewatch the water resistance test and, see what was left behind. So if you have a question about an ink that you've seen me test on my YouTube channel, a lot of them you can go see the water resistance test in action on Instagram. And my Instagram is gadgetstop321 also. All right. This is an ink where the writing experience varies from paper to paper. On really good, smooth, Japanese fountain pen friendly paper, I liked everything. On Rhodia, there were certain ones that I liked better than others. And then on copy paper, I wasn't that fond of any of them, but the Kakuno and the Explorer and the Mini Graft were the best out of the bunch. Let me see. Yeah, this watery ink didn't have any trouble with it seeping through the page, but one of the things that I wasn't fond of on the lesser quality paper was how quickly it soaked into the paper and maybe kind of spread just a little bit. You know that feeling of the ink spreading out very quickly as you're writing. But on good paper, this ink is a winner. And I like this type of water resistance that leaves the very legible gray component behind. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.